Thanks to all of you for coming today, and thanks for the invitation to come and speak. So a little bit of background, I worked for about 5 years with CSIRO Marine and Atmospheric Research over outside Melbourne. Left CSIRO about this time last year to move back to the United States, where I'm from, which is why I don't have a really super cool Australian accent. I joined this outfit, so Oak Ridge National Laboratory. It's a big national lab in the US, 6,000 people, all in one site. It's the sort of largest energy R&D laboratory in the United States. It started a climate change science institute in 2009, which has about 100 researchers working in that. And within that institute, I work in a small but hopefully growing group looking at the sort of science and research around assessing the consequences of climate change and also how do we adapt or manage those consequences. So I'm actually in a landlocked institution, which is unfortunate. In CSIRO, I could walk across the street and be on the beach. And not doing a lot of work in the coastal zone these days, but a lot of my work in CSIRO when I was here was working with local government to undertake climate change, vulnerability assessments, risk assessments, largely in coastal communities. So that was kind of an eye-opening experience for me. And really sort of galvanized my appreciation for the need for researchers to work in collaboration and partnership with people in local communities who actually understand and have that local knowledge, but also the ones who are charged with managing those communities themselves. So today, there's sort of three things that I'd like to talk about. I want to start out just talking about coastal values quite broadly, and I always think it's always nice to look at pictures of the beach. So I'll use my own sort of vacation photos to talk about the sort of diversity of interests that we have in the coastal zone. And after that sort of fluffy opening, I'll move on to talk about vulnerability assessment more specifically, some of the work I've actually been involved in here in Australia, as well as some other examples of vulnerability assessment you might see in other places. And sort of talk about how that information feeds in or sometimes doesn't feed into decision making at the practical level. And then finish off talking a little bit about these sort of issues around equity and how we make decisions around coastal management. So talking about coastal values. So this is a sort of Google Earth image of Cairns. This is where I was last week at the Greenhouse 2011 conference, but actually put this slide together 5 or 6 years ago for another conference where I was asked to talk about the coast. And what's interesting about the coast and their importance in the global landscape is I see them as this intersection between these big sort of global spheres. It's where the atmosphere, the ocean, the land all comes together, and they all interact in very interesting ways. And we have different types of systems. So we have the sort of reef system off the coast that gives way to a sort of open ocean system. We have this estuarine wetland ecosystem to the south of the CBD. And then we also have this, thriving urban ecosystem, which is, a hub for commerce and economic activity. It's where people live. And you can throw more. So we have agricultural enterprises in this area as well. So we see this kind of sort of dynamic interaction throughout the world. Coasts are an area where are experiencing rapid growth, not only in Australia, but certainly in the United States. In Europe, particularly in Asia, we're seeing large urbanization and growth on the coastal zone. So it's a very interesting place to study, and quite often it can be a very nice place to live as well. So what I'll just do is sort of talk through, for me, vulnerability assessment and managing the coast is basically all about how we value these different types of assets and interests in these environments. So we can relax before we get into the technical stuff. So some of the things we have in the coastal zone: personal property, individual property rights. So a few images. The one from the Gold Coast you'll recognize. This is a resort in Fiji where I stayed a few years ago, and the bottom one is an island in Croatia. So we have those kinds of values. Economic activity. So this is a little hut on an island in the Caribbean that belongs to Colombia called San Andres. And you know, that's someone's livelihood, this little hut on a beach where they sell snacks and drinks in a very serene setting. Another weird restaurant in Croatia you can only get to by boat, and a cafe in the surf on the North Sea in Germany. So lots of recreational opportunities in the coastal zone, which is one of the reasons why, you know, this basically represents tourism, right? And that's me on the Great Barrier Reef on my honeymoon several years ago. Transportation interests, so obviously things such as ports, shipping are directly linked to the coast, but also like this photo on the left again from Germany, which is stacks of bicycles, which is generally what folks there use to get to and from the beach. Biodiversity. Art. So when I was down in Cottesloe Beach a couple of years ago, there's a sort of art installation on the foreshore there that I thought was kind of interesting. And scenic amenity, another one of the draws to the coastal zone. So we were touring around New Zealand last year, and a sunset again off the coast of Croatia. Waste disposal. So, you know, surprisingly, in many areas, you know, the coasts are where people dump things. And, you know, occasionally people are buried at the coast as well, which maybe doesn't count as waste disposal, but, you know, I thought you'd get the drift. And then there's all these sort of very fuzzy values in the coastal zone. So things like future generations. So this is the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse. I used to visit there when I was a child. When that was originally built, it was half a kilometer inland. And that was at the sort of mid-19th century. And over time, the coastal zone eroded away on this barrier island. But, you know, there's a lot of cultural significance. It was an icon of the community. So eventually I decided, well, you know, to keep this thing from tumbling into the ocean, we're just going to jack up the whole lighthouse. And they moved it inland about 1.5 kilometers, where it'll stay and presumably be resilient until the coast erodes again. And so at some point down the road, we might see this happening. But so we have this sort of identification with these types of landmarks. We want to see them preserved. We don't want to think about them essentially falling into the ocean. And that's my daughter on the coast of Germany about 3 weeks ago. And so, you know, I'd like to know that at some point she'll be able to come back to that stretch of beach when she has children and play there just as I did. And it's a very nondescript, intangible value, but I think that's certainly, you know, one of these values that we embody in the coast. So when it comes to things like climate change, fundamentally what we have is a situation where all of these different types of values are at risk. And it's pretty easy to think about the environmental values and environmental threats, so things like sea level rise, sea level variability, extreme events, storm surge, for example. I like to remind people at the coastal zone, you've got more extremes than just what's happening in the ocean and the nearshore environment, particularly in Australia. We have big cities on the coastal zone, so things like extreme rainfall events, extreme heat events are also threats to the coastal zone that have to be managed. Things around erosion, loss of foreshore, loss of coastal wetlands. These are sort of the physical consequences of variable environments and also threats potentially associated with climate change. We also have a range of socioeconomic risks. So how do these environmental risks pose threats to existing infrastructure, threats to future developments that we might like to install but haven't yet, threats to public safety, potential loss of these amenity values and scenic amenity, loss of revenue and economic activity, and also sort of loss of sense of place. You know, how are our identities tied up in the coastal zone? How do we assess risk to things like that? And these things sort of interact. So this is one of the big challenges in managing the coastal zone is we have environmental risks that threaten social values. We implement some kind of response to protect those values. That feeds back to alter the environment. And so we see that with activities to, for example, manage erosion. We solve a problem in one place, it gets displaced somewhere else, and we have to go in and manage that problem. So I work in this area called adaptation, which has sort of emerged as this discipline, particularly around the issue of climate change. It's basically a sort of a process of managing risk. And there's all these formal academic definitions of what is adaptation, but I think I sort of describe it in three different types. There's essentially policies and measures which are adjustments to existing vulnerabilities. So if we know we have a stretch of the coastline that's eroding, we have a problem there right now in the present day, we have to implement some kind of response to react or adjust to that particular situation. And that's kind of routine management practice, so that's nothing new. The newer issue is around things such as climate change, sea level rise, for example, changes in climatic extremes. So here we're talking about adaptation in terms of how do we adjust in response to what we anticipate the future is going to look like, what the future threats are going to be somewhere down the road, recognizing that there's often quite a bit of uncertainty around what's going to happen in the future. So, for example, future coastal inundation, which is a hot topic around Australia. And then the third type is much more broader, nebulous. And this is the idea that we don't just adapt to, say, sea level rise. We adapt to a whole group of changes that we experience. So population's growing, the economy's growing, changing in different ways in different regions. The things that people value change over time. So this is more about sort of big picture idea of, well, we want to adapt and develop sustainable communities, resilient communities that can cope with a variety of changes on the horizon. So there's two types of challenges to doing this. One is sort of the technical challenges. And so this is a cartoon. It basically shows two sort of academic, professorial types. And one of them says, what it comes down to is the government wants to know how some random equation will help America. And so the idea is, there's knowledge out there that experts have that can be harnessed and utilized to make decisions about, say, coastal management. So knowledge, data, tools, understanding of physical processes, modeling, prediction and forecasting, the tools of the trade for experts. But of course you also have these sort of institutional challenges, and this guy's looking in a door and it says Department of Wastage, formerly referred to as middle management. And this sort of embodies our perceptions of perhaps government institutions at all levels that are somewhat bumbling and perhaps not particularly efficient, and maybe not always acting in the interests of all involved. And so there's a lot of challenges around leadership, around how structures are organized, obviously legislative challenges, conflicts among local government, state government, private sector, the public, things you guys probably deal with on a regular basis. So I would argue that adaptation efforts and Australia, I would say, is really ahead of the game relative to many areas around the world that are thinking about climate adaptation. But a lot of these efforts are really focused on resolving the sort of technical aspects. So if we have more knowledge about how climate change is going to affect our coasts or our communities, we'll be able to respond to that and reduce risk. And so adaptation planning, this sort of formal adaptation planning, development of response strategies is growing quite rapidly, both in Australia and around the world. So this is some data from a paper we published last year, and we just sort of tried to calculate how many adaptation plans do we see emerging from, say, local, state, or national governments, around the world. And over time, you get this kind of curve where they're essentially the number of these things that are out there is doubling every year or two. And so people are rapidly embracing, we have to adapt to climate change. It means we have to have a plan on how to adapt to climate change. And they go off in their little departments or agencies and develop these plans. So that's an example of one that was done a few years ago for the city of Port Phillip around Melbourne. And then the City of Melbourne's adaptation plan and risk assessment, which was done in 2008, I believe. And so in undertaking these adaptation plans, vulnerability assessment or risk assessment is sort of seen as a critical tool for deciding what plans we're going to prioritize or implement as a community, as an agency to manage risk. So this was a map I put together with Rob Kay after a conference a couple of years ago. And we just quickly tried to figure out how many different sort of vulnerability assessments or adaptation plans can we identify around Australia at any given, at that particular moment in time. And I'm not going to go through all of these, but suffice to say, I'm trying to tell you there's a lot of activity in a very short amount of time. Several different programs. So there were the local adaptation pathways programs, rounds 1 and 2, which gave resources to local government to develop climate change risk assessments and adaptation plans. The grants were on the order of $50,000 to $75,000. Not a lot of resources, but it helped local governments start to get off the ground and coping with some of this stuff. I had a couple of projects that I'll talk about in what was called the Integrated Assessment of Human Settlements program, and then a lot of more sort of individual events, WA, South Australia, New South Wales, Queensland, around the country that all represent similar types of activities. So local government's really taking a leadership role in trying to get its head around what needs to be done. And this is probably 2 years old by now, so if you did this again, you probably wouldn't be able to fit all the projects on the map. So the big challenge in doing this kind of work is we really have two different communities of people. So we have a community of people that is really knowledgeable about climate change and climate science and formal assessment methods for climate change. And then we've got this other community of folks that are really involved at the local level in, say, coastal zone development, coastal management. And those are really, I would argue, sort of separate communities. So the climate change folks are basically focusing on future changes in the climate. They tend to be sort of climate scientists. They're involved in basic research. Meanwhile, the coastal management people are actually people embedded in management organizations, such as local government or state government, have a lot of local knowledge, and are more in touch with the local community. And these guys have been doing things somewhat separately, and the big challenge is how do we get those guys to actually work together? How do we give the folks working in coastal management at the local level some of the knowledge and tools that folks at the higher levels are playing with to help them do their job? So this means developing place-based climate change assessments, again, integrating different types of knowledge, and perhaps most importantly, developing practical tools that decision makers can actually use. So quite often, historically, adaptation planning, vulnerability assessment has been a rather academic exercise done by nerdy people like myself sitting in universities that don't necessarily have a lot of experience in environmental management, public policy. And so sometimes we do things that we think are great intellectually or scientifically, but we hand them off to folks in government and they go, I have no idea what to do with this. And therefore, it's not helpful for public policy. So we have to get beyond that. Okay, so some examples of assessments. So if you think back about all those sort of values that I talked through at the beginning, essentially what we're trying to do with vulnerability assessment is identify how things such as climate change or other factors pose a threat to those values. So we have a series of questions. We might want to know what makes communities vulnerable to sea level rise, climate change. We might want to know, well, what consequences are we going to experience? Or when are those consequences going to occur? So issues around timing. Where are they going to occur? You can move down the list and start getting into more sort of decision-making things. So, well, what can we actually do to cope with this problem? How much might that cost? And how will we actually implement it? So in order to answer these kind of questions, assessments have to be built for purpose. So it's no sense me sort of saying, well, I'm going to do a vulnerability assessment without ever talking to people in that particular community, develop a product and say, hey, look, I've done your vulnerability assessment. Isn't that great? I won't have the local knowledge and understanding. I won't understand what their priorities are. I won't know a lot about how the system actually works. So it's very unlikely that I'm going to be able to give them any information that's actually useful. Okay, so let's look at a few vulnerability assessments, a couple different types. So this is some work that our lab did about a year ago. That is airport-looking thing is Langley Air Force Base, sort of just outside Washington, D.C. It's a low-lying area, largely built on fill. We did some work for the Department of Defense that sort of said, well, okay, if we have some sea level rise around this area, what are the consequences likely to be? And so we can basically visualize the inward penetration of water around this particular facility. If we assume, say, I think this assumes up to about 1 meter of sea level rise going into the future. And interestingly, you see this a lot with airports around the world. They tend to be very low-lying, built on fill, and highly susceptible to flooding. So, but largely focused around inundation. So we didn't actually look at, well, what actually will be underwater, how much is it worth, how much is it going to cost, or any type of actions to do anything about that threat. So we informed the Department of Defense, yep, very vulnerable. And that was about the extent of the work that we did. Another type of product, this is some inundation mapping tool. It's online. This was done for the Mississippi Gulf Coast. So New Orleans is sort of down this way. It's an area that was hit hard by Hurricane Katrina. This is a simple tool. You can go online, zoom in on an area. You can put in an address. So this is the actual address of the parents of a colleague of mine. And so that pops up on the map. And then you can play with different scenarios. So this is, right now, this is a 3-foot sort of inundation scenario associated with, say, sea level rise or a small storm surge. If we kick that up to about 6 feet, we can sort of see that spreading. And if we include the storm surge that was associated with Hurricane Katrina, we can see that area of inundation expands significantly. So nice little tools. We can go out to people and go, hey, look at this. But again, you know, no actual quantitative assessment of how much is actually going to cost. Largely sort of communication tool. Other types of products. So this is some work done by Kathy McInnes at CSIRO using LiDAR data and a storm surge inundation model to basically map out for all of Port Phillip Bay, and she zoomed in on particular areas, areas that are susceptible to inundation in response to both a sea level rise as well as a storm surge event superimposed on top of that information. And even more recently, all the work that the Department of Climate Change has been funding to do inundation mapping for essentially every reasonably populated area around Australia. So now you can go online and get a nice high-resolution image of your particular community and look and basically, you know, you can find your house on the map and say, you know, is it going to be underwater? So, well, of course, there's always a disclaimer which says, you know, we spent all this money, but don't actually make any decisions with any of this stuff. So we're just going to scare you with it. So the big question comes up then, how does this type of information actually help people make decisions? How does this information give people understanding of what the consequences are going to be, either to their community, social consequences, economic consequences? And it really doesn't. So a lot of our vulnerability assessment, particularly in the coast, has been focused on telling people what's going to be underwater at some point in the future, and then saying, and you have to deal with this. But looking at the downstream consequences of that, and particularly how can those risks be managed, has not necessarily been a priority for any of the groups that have been supporting vulnerability assessment. So I'll talk through a couple of case studies that I was involved in, one in Western Port region of Victoria and another up in Sydney. So both of these were projects in collaboration between CSIRO and folks in local government. And this gives you a flavor of you know, some of the types of vulnerability assessment that can be done. So this first study in Western Port, we were working with the Western Port Greenhouse Alliance. There's 5 local governments around the port. We had funding from the Australian Greenhouse Office. That's what it was back then. It's now Department of Climate Change, or Department of Climate Change and Energy Efficiency. I always had trouble in Australia keeping up with agency names. They seem to change all the time. And we also had some funding from state government. We put together a consortium of people. So we had folks from CSIRO, we had folks from universities, and we had consulting companies that are understanding sort of economic valuation and natural hazards. And the local governments thought, climate change was important. They'd already done some scoping studies and are looking for a little bit more information about how climate change particularly was going to affect the built environment in the region. So you wanted to understand, how big might the impacts be and what can we do about it. So again, Kathy McInnes did some storm surge inundation modeling around the Western Port Bay under different scenarios. So what area would be inundated given a 1 in 100-year storm event, either currently, which is the yellow area, or in 2030, given additional sea level rise, or in 2070, given more sea level rise. So we're able to map that out. This is about a 100-meter resolution. Since then, she's gone back and redone this at about 1-meter resolution. So, again, data and tools change quite rapidly. And so what we're able to do is then take that information, put it into a geographic information system, and take all the information we could get from local governments about their assets, properties, property values, stormwater drainage infrastructure, the road network, boating facilities, anything that we could put on a map and basically look at the intersection between these different types of resources. And so we could come up with these sort of plots and say, well, how much is actually exposed in this particular region? How many properties are we talking about? What is their collective value in dollar value? How many roads are we talking about? Which roads are they? Are they critical transportation corridors or not? How many people are we talking about? And we could compare that across different types of threats. So in addition to looking at sea level rise, we looked at bushfire events. We looked at inland flooding associated with extreme rainfall. And then we sort of developed this sort of quantitative information, and we kind of handed that information over to the local governments themselves. And we sort of said, okay, well, that's our understanding of risk. What does this information mean for you? So we kind of took a step back and said, that's the extent of what we can do on the expert side. It's up to you guys to decide how important is this information to you and what do you do with it. So they took it and came up with a sort of list of priority concerns for local government. So across that suite of information, these are things we really care about. I think it's rather funny that the number one risk across 5 local governments was associated with a sea level rise, but it wasn't sea level rise itself. It was uncertainty due to the lack of planning controls about how to respond to sea level rise. So what they're saying is our biggest problem is the fact that state government hasn't given us guidance about what to do about this problem. Given that guidance, we can put it in, we can implement it, we can manage risk, but without that sort of policy guidance, we don't know what to do. So for each of these, we came up with types of response strategies to deal with the problem. So we can do a range of things around capacity building, so we can talk to the community about this information. We can collect more data, we can do more research. But if we want to reduce vulnerability, if we actually want to do something to protect properties, then ultimately we need to work on the legislative side of things. So lobbying state government to give us legislative guidance that gives us power to actually make decisions about managing sea level rise in the coastal zone. So we've gone beyond simply telling people what's at risk and giving them an opportunity to decide how it's going to be managed. So the other project was in Sydney. It involved 15 local governments, the Sydney Coastal Council's group. This was another project in the same program funded by the Australian Greenhouse Office, and CSIRO actually co-invested in this project as well. So I just happened to be lucky to rock up in Australia about the time both of these projects were kicking off, and I managed to get myself onto both of them. Both of these, by the way, are about $500,000 in funding, to give you a sense of scale associated with these. So again, it was CSIRO working with the University of the Sunshine Coast and Tim Smith, who I believe has given talks here in the past. In contrast to Western Port, Sydney, they didn't really have climate change on their radar. And this is all sort of my own sort of subjective opinion, so don't take it. But they weren't really out in front of thinking about this particular issue. So we're working more with a blank slate in local government around climate change and what it actually means. You know, for them, adaptation was like, first of all, they thought, yeah, we're adapting, we're reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So there's this whole other suite of responses they hadn't thought about. And second, there were a lot of opinions of, come on, something else that local government is now being charged to deal with. You know, we've got enough on our plate as it is. So what we're actually trying to do there is really understand what is the capacity of local government to adapt to or manage risks such as climate change. So a slightly different focus. We didn't want to just go in and say, here's all the problems you have, your stuff, deal with it, but actually look at, okay, if you guys actually wanted to respond to this issue, manage it, what are the things standing in your way? So how can we identify those activities that will empower you to make decisions? And we did that through sort of this top-down strategy. So we started off with a vulnerability assessment. And the idea here was to sort of develop an engagement tool that allow us to talk to local government about climate change, about sort of the types of consequences associated with climate and climate extremes, and how those are going to interact with, you know, essentially the city of Sydney as a community. We took that information into a series of workshops. So we sort of actively engaged. We had 15 workshops, went in each of the local governments, took our vulnerability assessments and sort of pulled out the information specific to that local government, and spent a few hours sort of talking through that information. Is this good? Is it bad? Does it match up with your understanding of vulnerability? Sometimes it did, sometimes it didn't. It actually helped us get an understanding of what local government thought the big issues were, what types of threats they said, yeah, we know about that, we're on top of that, versus others where they didn't have as much understanding. And then from that, we did a series of interviews where we put a few social scientists, they went out, they talked to staff all the way from entry level all the way up to senior managers and counselors, and sort of said, okay, adaptation to climate change in your community, how are you going to do it? What's standing in your way? Is this important? Is it not important? And then from that, we developed a series of recommendations around what to do about it. So for our vulnerability assessment, we looked at a broad suite of factors that might contribute to vulnerability. So we used this sort of conceptual model where we said, the impacts associated with climate change are going to be due to exposure to climate and climate extremes, things like sea level rise, a storm surge event, and the sensitivity of whatever's there to those events. So low-lying areas, more likely to be adversely affected. Elderly individuals, less capable of managing risk or more susceptible to injury. And that gave us information about where we're likely to see impacts. But then we also looked at this fuzzier information around adaptive capacity, which we sort of framed in terms of, okay, what are the resources, assets, knowledge, ability of local government and or individual homeowners to take steps that are going to reduce their vulnerability. So this is basically about how well prepared are you or equipped are you to manage risk. So it gives us something about the policy context and institutional context. And so we had indicators of all this. So a range of different types of data, both physical data, socioeconomic data. And then we looked at things such as how much revenue is flowing into a council. So how much money they're receiving from rates that can be reinvested in management. And also looked at some local government performance surveys done by state government in terms of how well local governments are performing. Has a council been sacked in recent years? So a wide variety of information. And we put these into these kinds of maps. And so this is a map of coastal vulnerability around Botany Bay. That the red areas would be areas of greater vulnerability. As you move away, vulnerability goes down, and since it's coastal, sooner or later you get far enough away from the coast that you're unlikely to be affected directly by coastal processes. But this is, again, a function of different things. So, exposure has one pattern, sensitivity has another pattern, and then adaptive capacity has yet another. And so what we were trying to do with this, and I emphasize trying, is take this information, go into local government and communicate and say, really, you've got a number of things going on here. So yes, you have to deal with climate, you have to deal with sea level rise, you have to deal with that coastal management, but you also have to think about the communities that you have and how they're changing over time. You also have to think about both your ability as a local government, as an institution, to manage these risks. And some found this really helpful and interesting, at least in terms of thinking about the problem. Others really, really did not like it. They go, what is this adaptive capacity stuff? Tell me what's going to be inundated, and I, as a coastal engineer, a coastal manager, can do something about that. But when you throw in all this other stuff that we don't actually have a responsibility for managing, I don't know what to do with this. Some of the other feedback we got, I was told at this conference last week by a PhD student who's talking with folks about local government and adaptation, and he had heard that these maps single-handedly reduced property values in Sydney by 20%. Anybody believe that? No, I didn't either. But shows you some of the controversy that can be tied up in producing this kind of stuff. And if that's the response that people have to the information, is it really useful if you're trying to facilitate change, or do people just sort of reject it? I was also called up by a nice elderly woman in Rockdale Council, which is over here, called me up directly and berated me. And said, what are you saying our council is vulnerable? We're not vulnerable. We have a lovely council, a close-knit community. We work very hard. We really care about the environment and so on and so forth. And so it was this idea that being labeled as vulnerable was sort of a four-letter word. We saw this with all the councils where none of them wanted to be highly vulnerable, but none of them wanted to have no vulnerability. They all wanted to be in the middle. So enough of a problem to continue justifying the need for resources and investment, but not a big enough problem that it looked like they weren't actually on top of it. So I learned quite a bit as a researcher about how you communicate information and how people respond to information. And I've had other projects around vulnerability assessment that died horrible deaths halfway through because a local or state government, in one instance, decided, we actually don't want to know. But ultimately what we did was, again, get at recommendations. So, okay, based upon what we know, what can we tell local government about what they can do to move forward with this? And so I spent a lot of time developing these very clever, phrases, different types of actions to get around barriers to adaptation. So we had one called Know Your Enemy. The enemy is climate change, and it's all about developing this understanding around what are the consequences and risks. Department of Climate Change didn't like that because they thought it was too controversial. They thought Know Your Enemy, they thought they might be the enemy, or state government might be the enemy. Yeah, but I refused to change it. Planning for change. This is all about how do we get climate change into planning frameworks, get smart, implementing education programs for the community and staff, monitoring climate change, monitoring vulnerability, putting the house in order, so developing internal and external arrangements, and again, some money talk. So we all know that money is always a constraint on action. And this is all in a report that we did that's available. And for each of these, we had a range of different types of specific recommendations about what to do. Okay, so what did we learn from all this? Well, one, it made us very, very famous as researchers in Australia. So the work in Sydney won 2 awards, the Eureka Prize for Innovative Solutions to Climate Change, and a Coastal Conference Award, and the work in Western Port won the Victoria Coastal Council Award. But of course, it's more about building capacity. So providing information to local government and stakeholders, demonstrating that you can't actually start looking at this stuff at the local level. It doesn't have to be a big report that's put out that's supposed to cover all of Australia. You can actually start looking at your individual community to think about these things. A lot of people started using that work for subsequent projects, for saying, well, we want to do that in our community. So then CSIRO had people calling up, we want to do one of those here. And we're like, it's $500,000. But some people use this for adaptation planning. So Hornsby Shire Council used our vulnerability maps as a step forward in doing specific council adaptation planning. Some local governments started hiring climate change officers or developing cross-departmental task force, because one of the things we found is there's a lot of silos in local government where we go into meetings, people would come into the room and introduce themselves because even though they worked in the same local government, they never met before. And ultimately what we've seen, and we're not going to take credit for this, but Queensland, most recently last week, New South Wales, Victoria, have rolled out guidance for local government, planning guidelines about these are the numbers you're going to use to plan for sea level rise. And all this work coincided with a sort of bottom-up groundswell around, you know what, we as local government need more guidance about what to do. And again, a lot of this generated opportunities for us as researchers to talk about adaptation, to talk about vulnerability, to talk about climate change. It also gave local government opportunities. So they said, well, now we've gone away and done some work. We can actually sit down with the community and talk about what this actually means. In Westernport, Mornington Shire Peninsula held a series of community forums to talk about the work. They had over 1,000 people show up to those community forums. But it's important to remember that these things don't always give you the desired outcome. So if you thought, I'm going to do this and then I'm going to know exactly what to do, maybe not. Or I'm going to do this and everybody's going to love us, maybe not. So there are some potential risks. So that leads to the last bit. So thinking about how do we make decisions. So, and you guys, this is stuff you guys would be far more familiar with than myself, but you know, in thinking about how we manage these types of risks, there's two types of risks that any decision has to cope with. One is the impact risk. So we have to manage the risk of sea level rise on the coast. The second is the policy risk. So what are the consequences associated with whatever policy we choose to deal with this particular problem? If we choose to build a 10-meter seawall, is that going to endear us to the community? Or are there going to be consequences and costs associated with that? So institutions are constantly sort of juggling these things. So it's a balancing act. So if the policy risk seems really high and the impact's not particularly worrisome, you're not going to act. The flip side is if the impacts seem really, really large and there's actions you can take that can occur at low cost, or you know they're going to have a benefit, you know they're going to be accepted or adopted or supported by the community, those are obviously much more easy to implement. So, some examples. So this is some pictures taken by Roger Jones on the beach, basically across the street from Sire Labs in Aspendale. So we have a situation where a bunch of houses, they've got the dunes right in front of their houses are eroding, worried about further erosion, so they've managed to petition the council to come in and essentially put sandbags in front of their property. What does that do to other properties? I now go out on my porch and I have to look at big piles of sandbags next door. You know, an investment that protects a small number of houses that are paid for by the entire community. What does that mean? How do we feel about, you know, backhoes driving up and down the beach? So issues around trade-offs between individual and community interests. How do we manage those? Most of adaptation policy is going to come down to this. Another example from the US. So again, coastal North Carolina, that lighthouse I showed earlier is right there. So 2003, tropical cyclone came through, and this shows you just how narrow this barrier island system is. One highway running up the middle, big houses on either side, and the tropical cyclone came through, took it all out, took out the road. This was an inlet, didn't used to be there, that used to be closed off. So a lot of property lost. What do? Good old US Army Corps of Engineers comes back in, spends several months filling in the inlet. They build a new road. Notice a lot of the houses are no longer there because they were complete write-offs. So again, so this is, you know, public funds being spent to continue to prop up a community which is extremely vulnerable. It's a highly dynamic system. So how do we feel about that? You know, if it's your house, you're probably quite supportive. If it's not, it's a problem. And incidentally, the folks who did live down here, that was the only way in and out. So for about 6 months, they were completely cut off from land. So the thing is, you know, these costs are not borne equally. So we were balancing this issue of when do we, you know, failing to act when we need to versus, you know, acting when we don't need to. And this is the big anxiety we always have. How big of a problem is climate change? It's uncertain. You know, what do we do? And these things are hard to reconcile when there's uncertainty. I'll be the first to say there are significant uncertainties about future climate change. How much sea level rise are we going to see? And also when we have conflicts among values. So it's really hard to reconcile this stuff when we have things such as people want to go in and develop, or I want to build my dream house retirement home on the foreshore, versus folks who want to preserve that foreshore for other activity. I'll skip that and close with a message that I like to send, which is a lot of adaptation and vulnerability assessment is based upon telling institutions how much trouble they're in and shame on them for not doing more to get on top of the problem. And I listened to this all last week with prominent scientists in the field, you know, wagging their fingers at, you know, folks in federal government, the international community, because they hadn't done enough to manage the huge risks associated with climate change. But we move these things forward much better when we can think about opportunities as opposed to thinking about risk. So this comes from someone in local government, one of our projects. I wish we hadn't done this project because now we know that there are risks and we have to do something about it. So someone of that mindset, are they going to be in a positive mindset to really take advantage of opportunities? Probably not. The flip side is opportunities. Someone else in local government, same project. I think it's a good time for councils to begin thinking about this issue. You know, right now they're undergoing a process of updating all their local environmental plans and development control plans. So it's like, since we're already doing that, it's a great opportunity to take information, put it in there, real easy, low investment, and start thinking about this stuff. So these guys are really switched on and saw a lot of opportunities. My guess is these guys are going to be more adaptive over the long term than the ones who'd rather just go back to sticking their heads in the sand. And that's enough, I believe, because I'm hot and you probably are too.
Thanks very much.
My pleasure.